welcome to Lesson 11. This is going to be our lecture on the development of some of the medical ideas during the Ming and the Qing dynasties of China. Let's jump into our lecture. So let's just have a little overview of the lecture. We're going to talk a little bit about the Ming dynasty, about some of the trends of the thought that was happening in the Ming dynasty. And this kind of builds on what we were talking about last time with some of the Neo-Confucian trends of the Song dynasty. And we're going to be calling it this experiential skepticism, but we're also going to be looking at a Neo-Confucian named Wang Yangming, just a little bit, because he was kind of an influential philosopher. We're also going to look at Li Shizhen and his book, the Ben Sao Gong Mu, which is an extremely important herbal medicine materia medica text, and that was written in the Ming dynasty. And then we're going to look at Yang Zhizhu and the Zhenju Da Cheng, and that is a extremely important acupuncture and moxibustion text that was written during the Ming dynasty, and that's one of my favorite books, to be honest. We're going to also look at another school of thought, and this is kind of building on what we were talking about last time with the branching out of the many different schools of thought that were emerging in the Song dynasty. But here we have Zhang Jingyue, and he's going to be talking about his school of the supplementing yang school of thought, and it's going to have to do with a lot of the ideas about the Ming men and ministerial fire, kind of building on the ideas of that concept of this place of the kidneys as the seat of the yang qi and the original qi and the yuan qi, having to do with some of these ideas about the triple burner that we spoke about. And we're going to also then move on to the Qing dynasty and sort of the trend of moving from experiential skepticism to more of an evidentiary scholarship trend. And then we're going to look at one more very important school of thought, and this is warm disease, Wenbing, as it's called. And so this is an important theory in East Asian medicine about a big category of disease. So a lot of it has to do with infectious disease, influenzas and flus, and malarias, and things that are pathogens that spread very virulently between populations, so epidemics it has a lot to do with. And there are a number of very important scholars and physicians that have to do with Wenbing and the development of Wenbing. So we're going to take a look at that in particular, the development of Wenbing, because that is a very important development during the Qing dynasty. And then there is one more doctor and thinker that we're going to look at. His name is Wang Qingren. And he is an interesting person because he is sort of the first, or one of the first thinkers to start to, in a sort of rudimentary way, begin to have a comparative crossover between Eastern medicine and Western medicine. He starts to bring in Western ideas of anatomy. He starts to do dissections on corpses, and he's going to develop some novel theories that lead to some really useful and interesting herbal medicine formulas. And so we're going to look at that a little bit, and we're also going to then just finish it out by talking about the end of the imperial era. It's after the Qing dynasty, there is no more emperors, there's no more empire, no more Chinese empire. And so that is sort of the conclusion of the imperial and Confucian era. So we're going to just wrap up our presentation with that. So just a little brief overview about the Ming dynasty. Well, this is the dynasty that overthrows the Mongolian Yuan dynasty. As we talked about last time, the Mongolians took over all of China. They took over basically the whole world, practically. And they became the emperors of China. And so this is the Ming dynasty, and they overthrew them. And in a way, this is the last imperial dynasty that was ruled by what is called the ethnically Han Chinese people. So it's kind of an interesting dynasty in that sense. But in many ways, even though they overthrew the Mongolians, this dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, they continued a lot of the trends of government, and they still ruled through absolutism, and it was an immense concentration of power in the hands of the emperor. He was kind of one of those people who was very suspicious of others, and kind of thought people were out to get him, that kind of a thing. At one, there were multiple emperors, but they ruled with an iron fist in a sense. So that continues. It's not like they overthrew the Mongolians and then it was all hunky dory. So a little bit about the Ming Dynasty, though. It's in a sense, it's a continuation of the prevailing Neo-Confucian themes that emerged during the Song Dynasty, and we talked a little bit about the philosophers that have to do with Neo-Confucianism, such as Zhu and the Qings. And it's a period where there is a democratization of civil service. We talked a little bit about the civil service exams last time. And so Unshold says that the state examinations were standardized and simplified considerably. Practical abilities were now judged as more valuable than an extensive literary education. So it's sort of a trend towards pragmatism as opposed to kind of sort of like an erudite academic sort of a person. They want pragmatic results. But it's sort of like described as a fragmentation of and diversity of thought, but it's beneath this Neo-Confucian crust. And so the ensuing diversity of attitudes during the Ming Dynasty is remarkable. That's what Unshold says about it. So there is a lot of pluralism. And now you have this philosopher named Wang Yang, and he's kind of an important Neo-Confucian philosopher. And he has these ideas that can sort of be summarized, if you choose to summarize them in this way, as sort of experiential skepticism. That's what we're going to call it. And so Wang Yang was an influential Ming Dynasty statesman and philosopher, and his ideas represented a sort of syncretism of the three paths, as they're called, which is Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. And so this is a quote from a book that I was reading in preparation for some of these lectures. And they say that his new idea was that moral knowledge was innate and not learned. This discovery led to the radical belief that while we should study the writings of the sages, we should do it to reveal to ourselves what we already know intuitively. So it's this very idealist philosophy, in a sense, that all the knowledge is contained within us. And so you can also apply this to medicine. So for doctors that followed Wang Yang beliefs, they should study the classics, but they should apply skepticism. They should trust their own experiences, and they should use their own intuition to reach the way, to reach the Tao. And this was a little bit in contrast to the orthodox Confucians, who were much more strictly adhering to the classics, the scriptures, if you want to call them such. They were much more fundamentalist in that way. And so it's a little bit of a divergence, and you can kind of see how this, in a way, it incorporates ideas from maybe Taoism and Buddhism. It kind of diverges from orthodox Confucianism in a way, because they're bringing in this sort of metaphysical idea that, the innate knowledge of things is contained within you already. So just a little bit about Wang Yang. This is when he was alive, 1472 to 1529. Here's a quote by him. He says, "To know and not to act is to not know." After Zhu Xi, he is commonly regarded as the most important Neo-Confucian thinker. And so let's just talk a little bit more about experiential skepticism, just to kind of flesh the idea out a little bit. I just think it's a really interesting idea. It's interesting to me to chart out kind of like the trends of thought during these different periods, and it kind of gives you an idea of what, maybe a little bit about how people were thinking at the time. And so in experiential skepticism, you can kind of consider that mind is the principle. Mind is that Li that we talked about last time. The principle is your mind. It is your heart. And so true knowledge arises from direct personal experience and intuition. It's not from rote texts, memorizing quotes and text and external authorities. And so you're supposed to doubt untested assumptions, and you're supposed to verify things through action. It's kind of this experimental sort of perspective. It's very experiential. And you can come to truth, you can come to the knowledge of things by interacting with your intuition, your heart mind, with the world. And so, how this has relevance to, for instance, like the Ming Dynasty and medicine ideas during the Ming Dynasty, well, it sort of is a challenge to official canon, official ideas, orthodoxy. So, Neo Confucian doctors like Zhang Jiebin, for instance, he rejects blind adherence to the Huangdi Neijing. He insists on experiential verification. For example, he tests Shanghan Lun formulas empirically. He discards ones that he finds to be unproven, and he's like basically going against dogma. It's just it's kind of an anti-dogma kind of perspective. So the impact is that it sparks this experiential school of thought. And so, for instance, this creates an idea where case studies become really interesting, because it's like a case study is your recording your direct experience and sharing it with others. So it's kind of a cool period of time where people start writing case studies, and it also advances practical diagnostics, and this is like amidst the Ming Dynasty pluralism. So it's really a kind of a cool period of time with these people writing case studies, and they're really trying to kind of get rid of things that are just a little bit not really pragmatic. They're really trusting their own experiences. So how and why this transitions to Wang Yongmin experiential skepticism and its effects on Ming Dynasty? Well, by the end of the 15th, 16th century, Wang Yongming's school of mind, it overthrows the Neo-Confucian orthodox ideas from like Zhu Xie and Qing among intellectuals, and he teaches that true knowledge is intuitive and it must be proven through your actions. And he ridicules rigid book worship and abstract speculation. And this, you have to understand, this is kind of like this is a big deal, because in China and East Asian cultures, in many senses, the classics are held up to such a reverence. It's just part of Confucianism that they do that. And so this Ming Dynasty intellectual climate of skepticism towards Song Dynasty metaphysics directly produces a new generation of physicians who trusted personal experience over inherited theory. So for instance, Li Shizhen, he spends 27 years traveling. He tastes drugs and corrects centuries of copied errors with his Materia Medica that we're going to talk about. He extends innate knowledge through action. Then there's, for instance, another doctor called Wu Yuxing. He rejects Li Qi explanations of epidemics, and he proposes a new observable pestilential qi that enters the mouth and nose. And this kind of gets into Wenbing that we're going to talk about, worm disease theory. And then we have Zhang Jingyue and Yang Zhizhu and others. They compile massive works, massive texts on what actually works in their own clinics, in their own experiences, rather than just purely philosophical deduction. And so the result is that the Ming Dynasty as a whole is somewhat dramatically more empirical. It's a little bit less metaphysical than, for instance, like the Song Dynasty that we just went over last lesson. And it's more open to direct observation and innovation. And this is kind of the exact opposite of this previous Jin Yuan era, which was very theoretical, basically. This is Wang Yongming inspired experientialism. It's the experiential turn. It's the direct bridge to an even stronger Qing Dynasty classicism that comes next. And let's talk about a little bit Li Shizhen. He is a very important herbalist, very important author. And he is the author of the Ben Sao Gong Mu, which is a really crazy, gigantic herbal medicine text. It's a huge compendium. And this pharmacology text has 1,892 entries. It details more than 1,800 traditional Chinese medicines, includes 1,100 illustrations and 11,000 prescriptions. It also described the type, form, flavor, nature, and application in disease treatments of over 1,000 herbs. So this is a huge accomplishment of a text. And this becomes basically the most in-depth materia medica. You know, this is a huge, huge, huge thing. So it's just interesting to note that this crazy big, important, influential materia medica comes out of the Ming Dynasty, Ben Sao Gong Mu. And so the Ben Sao Gong Mu, it's basically the last major materia medica of the whole imperial traditional era of East Asian medicine, Chinese medicine. There's information in it concerning previously false classifications. So he's fixing things. He starts adding secondary names, including sources of the names. He collects explanations, commentaries, quotes, chronological order, including origins of the material, their appearance, time of collection, medicinally useful parts, similarities with other materials and medicinals. There's information concerning the preparation of the material. So some medicinals have to be prepared in a very specific way. For instance, some would be toxic if you don't prepare them. There's explanations of doubtful points. He corrects all sorts of mistakes. He explains the toxicity of heavy metal substances used for alchemy. He talks about the taste, the nature of herbs and materials. He talks about the enumeration of main indications, explains their effects, and he enumerates prescriptions in which the material is used, including the form and dosage of the prescription. So, gigantic text. And our author, actually, Paul Unshold, has a crazy long translation of this text, which you could read. I have actually not read the translation of this text because it is so big. There are like 10 volumes of these things. They are big. And you have to buy them volume by volume, basically. So haven't quite gotten there yet. That one's going to take me maybe another decade. But that's what it is, just so you know it's available. That's out there in case you ever do want to read the Ben Sao Gong Mu and Li Shizhen's gigantic, enormous work. You can do that. You can read the complete text translated and annotated by Paul Unshold. I added these two pictures because they seem really, to me, like maybe the most fascinating. He really goes in depth about so many different things. Excuse me, so many different things. Like, for instance, this one is kind of an introduction to history, pharmacology, and diseases and suitable pharmaceutical drugs. This one is about waters, fires, soils, metals, jades, stones, minerals, and salts. So it's all sorts of different materials. It's minerals, crystals, rocks, metals, all sorts of things. And so I might personally get this one because it just sounds really cool to me to hear him talk about all these different the properties of these different things. So that's out there. That's available. There is English translations of the Ben Sao Gong Mu, just so you know. Now, we also have a really amazing text called the Zhenju Da Cheng. This is called the Grand Compendium of Acupuncture and Moxibustion. I'm actually deep right now in trying to personally translate some of this stuff because it's not all translated. But there are some really good translations of it that are out there. But just like the Ben Sao Gong Mu, this is a gigantic compendium. And so the author, Yang Zhizhu, he kind of searched all around and he collected all of the best acupuncture texts of the time. And he compiles them together and he adds his commentary to this gigantic compendium. So for example, in this book, there's all these really wonderful odes. There's this Chinese character called Fu, and it means like an ode or a song or a poem. And basically this is like an oral rendition of something that is sort of in a style that's easily memorizable, the way that it's written. It's in a very simplified kind of memorizable style of writing. And so this is a way to verbally memorize acupuncture teachings. And so many acupuncture and moxibustion techniques were written this way, and because they were easily transmitted between people. And so he collected all these and put them in this gigantic compendium. It's super cool. It's similar to the book Zhenju Jiayi Jing from the Han Dynasty, which was like a big collection of knowledge at that time, except I would say this is even way more extensive. Way more extensive. So in my opinion, this is like a monumental text. It's like, in my opinion, probably like the culmination of acupuncture and moxibustion from like the imperial era. Because really, actually, in the Qing dynasty, acupuncture is not that, it's not regarded as highly. And so this might be perhaps the pinnacle text of classical Chinese acupuncture and moxibustion in many ways. So I think this is such a cool book, and the stuff that I've translated so far has been so really cool. It's such an interesting peek into kind of how people were thinking about acupuncture at the time. But there are many volumes of this book that have been translated already by really, really amazing scholars and authors and translators. So I definitely recommend checking them out. For example, this one is translated by Lorraine Wilcox, and she does amazing translations. She translated volume 9, but there's a bunch of other ones that are translated. And so just so you understand kind of the relevance of this book, if you were to flip open your Deadman, your Manual of Acupuncture by Deadman, and flip to a page, say some random point, right? Pick a point out of a hat, go to it on Deadman. And it'll have all these indications, all of these things that this point is useful for. Well, a lot of the references that it uses to substantiate the indications for that point will either pull from the Grand Compendium of Acupuncture Moxibustions, Zhenju Dacheng, or one of the odes that was compiled within it. For example, the Ode to the Golden Needle, the Ode to Mysterious Indications. There's all these wonderful odes. Ode to the 100 Diseases. And so those are all compiled in this really fabulous book, and they get referenced all the time in books that we use every day, like Deadman's Manual of Acupuncture. So next time you're flipping through your Manual of Acupuncture and you see that, oh, this point is for this, and it's used maybe in combination with this point for this, it'll tell you where that indication and that reference comes from. And it might be from this book or some of the books that are within it. So keep an eye out. Let's take a look at Zhang Jingyue. He's also known as Zhang Jiebin. So this is an important figure in the warm supplementation school. So he emphasizes tonifying yang and yin. And he especially used prepared Rehmannia, which is an herb especially for tonifying the yin. And so in many times he was nicknamed Zhang Shudi. Shudi means Rehmannia, so he's basically Rehmannia Zhang. And he developed some pretty influential theories on the gate of life, the life gate, the Ming Men, and the balance between yin and yang. And so he also incorporated some demonological medicine into the medicine of systematic correspondence. And so Unschuld mentions him, and he says that Zhang Jingyue, he considered demons to be creations of the human mind and therefore not phenomena of the real world. He thus regarded the appearance of demons as merely subjective symptoms of specific disturbances in the psychosomatic organism of the victim. So that's kind of a different take on the demonological ideas that have been permeating East Asian medicine. It's sort of more reminiscent of maybe what people might think of today if you're coming from more of like a psychology background or something like that. But it just goes to show how there's a very big plurality of ideas and disagreements and different perspectives, and people have different viewpoints on maybe what some of these ideas are. And so that has a sort of a modern idea to it in a way, and it's pretty interesting. He's got some books that have been translated as well into English. If you ever want to read Zhang Jingyue, you could read the 3-part book series that have been translated by Alan Soar. And I have one of these. I haven't gotten through all 3, but the one that I have is really good, and I will probably get the other ones eventually. It's expensive buying all these books, let me tell you. So, like I said, he kind of sort of integrates demonological ideas into the medicine of systematic correspondence in some ways. And Unshold talks about this. He says that excessive attraction or aversion can lead to an imbalance in certain influences in the organism, since these emotions stimulate an increased production in certain body depots. So, you know how the emotions are linked to the Zong Fu. Excesses or deficiencies in emotions can create imbalances in your physical body. And so Zhang advised an analysis of the inclinations and aversions of the patient. Ask them what they like, ask them what they don't like. This is reminiscent of what we're all taught in school. Part of diagnosis is we're asking these questions. One possible technique involved the use of the mutual relationships among the 5 phases, with which all emotions are associated. If the pathogenic emotion to be eliminated has been identified, one need only stimulate mildly the emotion which, according to the relationship of mutual destruction, destroys the former, and the cure is effected. So this is kind of a way of applying the 5 phases to emotions, to the treatment of psychosomatic and emotional diseases, and utilizing the 5 emotions to either tonify or drain excesses and deficiencies in emotional qualities. So I just think that's a really fascinating way that demonological medicine sort of in his work transforms into a sort of psychosomatic theory of emotions within the framework of systematic correspondences. So just a little bit more about his supplementing the warm and the yang school. So Zhang Jingyue was a leading Ming Dynasty physician, and his main emphasis was supplementation of warmth, supplementation of the yang. And so what this is that it's putting the primacy on protecting and supplementing your yang qi. That's kind of the root and the governor of your life. The yang deficiency underlies many chronic diseases, particularly involving the spleen, stomach, and kidneys. He advocated warm tonics to bolster the yang, and he opposed excessive use of cooling or yin nourishing methods that would further damage the yang. And so this is a little bit in contention with some of the earlier theories that we spoke about, some of these other schools of thought, which maybe were more about supplementing the yin or cooling. You know, we talked about a school of thought that was specifically about using cooling herbs. So he might not be all about that. He might be thinking, well, maybe we need to supplement the yang. But it's all contextual. We all have access to these different schools of thought now, and we can use them when appropriate, depending on the situation. So another aspect of this is the balanced supplementation of yin and yang. So while employing heavy yin tonics, for instance, like Ramania, and that's why he earned his nickname, Zhang Shudi, he also combined these yin tonics with very warm herbs like futse, aconite, or roguei, the cinnamon bark. And the reason he did this was that it prevents it prevents yin excess, and it prevents that excessive yin from suppressing the yang. And so he was very critical of the overuse of too much cold or attacking formulas. And it also seeks to treat the root. And so for him, it's prioritizing and addressing the underlying deficiency, which would be deficiency of yang. And this is over, like, for instance, superficial symptoms. It's a gentle, sustained supplementation in moderate doses is favored over harsh dispersal or purgation. So his whole thing was, we are going to consistently supplement this person's yang qi, because the yang qi is at the root of life. It is at the root of function and activity, and you need the yang, the sun, the warmth, the heat, to be alive, basically. And so that is at the heart of Zhang Jingyue's warm yang school. And just a little overview about the Ming Men and the ministerial fire concepts. Since we're on the topic, even though these are old concepts, it's not like these concepts were invented in the Ming Dynasty, but he took them and really took them to a next level in a way, because this whole school of thought is based on it. So his views on this, they draw from, for instance, like Neo-Confucian ideas and Taoist ideas, And they see the body as rooted in primordial yang and qi. And this is the theory of the Ming Men, the gate of life. And so he thought that the Ming Men was central to vitality in his book, the Jingyue Quan Shu. That's the complete compendium. And so the Ming Men, as the residence of water and fire, it houses both the genuine yin and the genuine yang. And it serves as the abode of yin and yang, the essence of qi, and the root of life and death. So the location is between the kidneys, and it's even right here. There's an acupuncture point, GV4, called Ming Men. And so it's right underneath the seventh vertebra, and it contains the ministerial fire. Not the seventh vertebra. I think that might be wrong. Seventh vertebra is up here, but it's down here, lower lumbar. So the ministerial fire originates here as the basis for all yang activities. It's the source of your original qi. At the Ming Men, it is differentiated from earlier heaven and later heaven. So earlier heaven is like your origin, your source, your inheritance. And then later heaven is the idea that, you know, we also can create more qi. We can use that qi and create more essence and for ourselves, Jing. And that is more of like the spleen and stomach. It's the after heaven qi that we create ourselves from food and drink and all those activities of the body. The earlier heaven qi is the primal source qi, and that is more of like the prenatal essence of the Ming Men. So the clinical implications of this is that deficiencies in Ming Men lead to broad vacuity patterns. And this is basically like a yang qi vacuity. This is a yang warmth vacuity, and it creates cold. It creates weakness, poor digestion. And so treating that stresses the use of very warm and tonifying things that give the person yang qi and fire. And these are agents like aconite and cinnamon. And some people might not be about that because, you know, aconite is a toxic herb. You have to prepare it to reduce its toxicity so that human beings can consume it. But even today, there are people who advocate for the warm tonification school of thought. I know that Heiner Fruehauf, for example, has formulas specifically for yang tonification that are based on this doctor's ideas. So even though, you know, an herb like aconite has some precautions that come with it, it's widely used for very powerful yang tonification. But you also have things like cinnamon bark, rogueway. But these ideas and concepts profoundly shaped later medical thought. Basically, this was a pretty influential school of thought during the Ming Dynasty. But now let's move on to the Qing Dynasty. That's all we've got for our Ming Dynasty stuff this lecture. And so now, just like all the other dynasties, ultimately the Ming Dynasty is invaded and overthrown. And this time it's invaded by the Manchurians, the Manchus, and these are people that are to the north of China. They overthrow the Ming Dynasty and they found the Qing Dynasty in 1644. And this will be the last imperial dynasty of the Chinese Empire period. So generally the Qing, they continued the same absolutist rule as the Ming Dynasty and those that came before them. And they also continued aspects of the ideas of Neo-Confucianism that came from the Song Dynasty. However, many conservative, anti-traditional forces held the Song doctrines and its consequences responsible for the decline of the empire that had begun with the collapse of the Northern Song Dynasty. So with this Qing Dynasty, many people start to really question Neo-Confucianism. They start to really question all of these idealistic ideas of the Song Dynasty. They start to think, well, maybe we got it wrong here. You know, maybe all of this stuff was just wishful thinking. And so the medical thought of the times, as Unshold says, the medical thought of Ming and Qing eras adhered closely to general intellectual tendencies of the last two epochs of imperial China. So a lot of things continued forward, but they they continue to investigate things, go woo, and they investigate things and affairs and extend knowledge to the utmost. And this leads to many individual views and interpretations of the classics. This was kind of, as we remember, the idea that came out of the Song Dynasty. Everybody's investigating things and investigating affairs and extending their knowledge to the utmost. And it's creating all of these different schools of thought and interpretations of the classics, of reality, of the world, of ideas. And so in many ways it's a flourishing, but now also you're having people start to say, well, hey, maybe it's too much. Maybe we need some kind of authority. Maybe we need some kind of orthodoxy. It's become a little bit too subjectivist, where anybody can just investigate things and come up with their own theories, but now the theories aren't really working so well. So that's what led to all this kind of etiological reductionism, all these springing forth of different schools of thought, like cold, heat, all these different things that we've talked about over the last several lectures. And actually, increasingly, people start to look for Western explanations to medicine. They start to reject ideas that came out of the Song Dynasty and maybe a little bit after the Song Dynasty, and they start to look, maybe either they're looking to the West for new ideas, but also maybe they look even further, all the way back to the very most classics. They also turn to the most classic books and try to reground themselves in the classics as evidentiary scholarship, in a sense. They're looking for something to tether them to some kind of authority, some kind of truth, because it's really kind of spiraled out into subjectivism. But also they start to look to the scientific method, because during the Qing Dynasty, Western ideas start to penetrate much more. And so this extreme subjectivism that emerges post-Song Dynasty through the Ming Dynasty into the Qing Dynasty, during this period, so many views emerge that there's no real clear authority. It's a really an extreme subjectivism that happens. It's kind of a difficult situation when this occurs. That's the problem with subjectivism in many ways. How do you tell what's correct anymore? How do you know what's true? There's no real authority anymore. We're all working off our own interpretation of things based off of these ideas. And so decade after decade saw new theories proposed and older views criticized, with no single approach being able to achieve sufficient authority to displace the others. And systematic correspondence, in a sense, becomes a complex labyrinth. It's so complex, in a way, it's almost kind of similar to our postmodern situation today. There's just so many subjective ideas that really there is no grounding in a agreed upon truth anymore, in a sense. So there's kind of overlaps between this period in Chinese history and maybe even our postmodern situation. But it's an interesting time and period. And so some ideas that emerge out of this is what we'll call evidentiary scholarship. The critics blame the empty philosophizing of the Neo-Confucians and, for example, Wang Yang-ming. And they start to place a greater emphasis on the study of the earlier texts. So from Neo-Confucianism, we now are reverting back to the older Confucianist classics and the older medical classics, even to the point that some people are now criticizing even Confucius and Mencius, these old Confucian scholars. But at this time also, something that happens is that the Shanghanlun becomes the definitive textual authority of herbal medicine, because people start to look back to the classics and they start to find, all right, well, what was really valuable back then? What was really true in the classics? And people really start to revere the Shanghanlun on an even more high level. The Shanghanlun becomes kind of the most important herbal medicine classic, especially during this period of time. And in the Qing Dynasty, herbal medicine is really the thing. Acupuncture kind of takes a lower role in the Qing Dynasty in terms of medicine, and actually, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in our next lecture, Acupuncture sort of has a much lower status than herbal medicine during the Qing dynasty. So let's just talk a little tiny bit about evidentiary scholarship. It's also known as evidentiary learning. It was a major Qing dynasty intellectual movement, and it emphasizes rigorous philology, textual criticism, empirical verification, historical source analysis, and returning to the original ancient, such as the Han Dynasty era, meanings. It rejects Ming Dynasty era Neo-Confucian speculation, subjectivism, and metaphysical empty talk. So it's like they want to do away with all these ideas from the Song Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty of like, oh, you just investigate things, you come up with your own interpretation, or like, you have your own truth inside of your soul, and it's like you just follow your intuition, man. Maybe like these guys, maybe to these people, those were sort of like the hippies of China back in the day. If maybe I'm just projecting a little bit, but it's like there's like this similar sort of tension. It's all nothing new under the sun, right? So, but this is what's kind of happening. You have this shift where they're like, no, it's too subjective. We're going all the way back to the utmost classics, and we're grounding ourselves in that as the truth. So how this applies to Chinese medicine, it shifts medicine even more towards textual rigor and classicism. It treats the medical classics kind of like how Confucians would treat the Confucian classics. It elevates Zhang Zhangjing and the Shanghan Lun as the supreme pure authority. He becomes sort of like the medical sage of the time. And he is now elevated over ideas from the Ming Dynasty or the Song Dynasty of like the four great masters and all of this syncretism that's occurring during the Ming Dynasty that we just spoke about, all this pluralism and all these new ideas, these new schools of thought. They're like, you know what? Forget all that stuff. We're going back to the Shanghan Lun. So you have a bunch of scholars that end up using evidential methods to critique misinterpretations, verify additions, expose accretions, and rediscover original principles, original formulas. They start to argue that Zhang Zhangjing's approaches applied broadly. It's not even just cold damage. It's like this is a text for everything in a sense. But this also creates some tension because while this is happening, there's also innovations occurring. There's the warm disease theory that's developing, which we're about to talk about. And the warm disease theory is a super influential new theory that's going in a different way. So this is not based on the classics. This is really, even though there's ideas of warm disease in the classics, this is really a new innovation. So it's kind of like bifurcating in a way. And so even though there's these new theories, though, are coming under criticism, they face scrutiny because they're departing from these ancient sources, and that's the way of thinking of the day. So the overall effect of this, it promotes empirical, philological, empiricism in medicine, essentially. It's like a very empirical, text-based approach. So they focus on accuracy, case records, and ancient authority, while sometimes prioritizing textual purity over therapeutic flexibility, influencing later views of Chinese medicine as historically grounded and proto-scientific. So it's sort of like it's all about the Han Dynasty for them. That's like, that was the golden age, the original real golden age of Chinese and perhaps even like all of East Asian medicine, all these things like the Shanghan Lun, so the Nanjing. The evidentiary scholarship that emerged in the late Ming and Qing and was critical of Neo-Confucianism or Song learning. So this is Han learning. We're done with Song learning. We're done with all these new theories, all these new ideas. We're going back to the Han Dynasty. We're going back to the classics. That was a quote from Neither Donkey Nor Horse, which will be an important text in our next lecture. The ancient formula scholars strove to establish the Shanghan Lun as a practical book of clinical practice that was independent of the theoretical framework of the Neijing. In a sense, the Neijing was a little bit, maybe even too ancient. It's not empirical enough. They loved the Shanghan Lun. The Jin Yuan schools of thought, the four great masters, they're too ideological, they're too subjective, they're too Neo-Confucian. The Neijing is too ancient. It's not empirical enough. It's too theoretical. But the Shanghan Lun is perfectly in the middle, for them. It's like, this is empirical. This is perfectly empirical, and yet it's a classic. So that is why the Shanghanlun fits the sweet spot for these scholars during this Qing dynasty period. So let's just kind of compare these two approaches. You have the Ming dynasty that we just spoke about, and you have the Qing dynasty. So we have the experiential skepticism and we have the evidentiary scholarship. How does that really kind of like play out in practical terms if we were to apply these things? So who do they trust the most if they were to use these kind of lenses? Well, if you're a Ming dynasty person, you might trust yourself. You might trust your own clinical experiences. That's the highest source. But if you're a Qing dynasty scholar and medicine doctor, you might say, well, actually the highest source is Han Dynasty classics. It's the Shanghanlun. Why would each of these different time periods reject, for instance, the Jinyuan and the Song Dynasty masters? Well, for the Ming Dynasty, they might say this is all theoretical. They're not really working on real patients, because the Ming Dynasty people are, they're all about experience. But the Qing dynasty would say, well, this stuff isn't written down in the Neijing and the Nanjing and the Shanghanlun. This isn't from the classics. What about their favorite motto? Well, the late Qing or the late Ming and the Ming dynasty would say, knowledge and action must be one. Whereas the Qing dynasty would seek truth from facts. How do they each prove that they're right or correct? If you're from the Ming dynasty, you might say, here are my dramatic cases and the new formulas that I created that saved their lives. This is based on my experience. The Qing dynasty scholars and doctors might say, well, here is the exact line from the Neijing, the Su Wen. And that's the end of the discussion right there. They're quoting the ultimate source of truth in the classics. Even the writing style is different. The Ming dynasty is more personal, passionate. Sometimes it's more wild. Whereas in the Qing dynasty, it's short, dry, it's precise. And they're referencing the classics. The favorite tool of the Ming dynasty doctors, well, that would be their own experience in the clinic. For the Qing dynasty doctors, it's their earliest printed version of the classics. And you even have examples of doctors who fit into both of these categories. For the Ming dynasty, you would have, for instance, Li Shizhen, Wu Yuke, Zhao Xianke, Zhang Jingyue. In the Qing dynasty, you have Yu Tianshi, Wu Zhutang, Shui Zhengbai, Wang Mengying. A lot of those Qing dynasty people are people in the Wenbing, the warm school of thought, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But if we were to just boil it down, the super simple takeaway, for Ming dynasty people, Ming dynasty doctors say, my patients are the proof. The experiences of this clinic are the proof. For the Qing dynasty scholars and the doctors, they would say, this 2,000-year-old book, this is the proof. And so that is sort of, they're both disagreeing with the Song dynasty Jinyuan great masters, as they're called. But they're disagreeing for different reasons in different ways. And so this kind of, I hope, explains the sense of why they would each disagree in their own different way. And that kind of puts it into perspective for a bit. So now let's talk about Wenbing. So for Wenbing, that is called warm disease. Wenbing, that translates directly as warm disease, warm illness. So the history of Wenbing in Chinese medicine is a key development in understanding and treating acute, febrile, and epidemic diseases. This is like fevers, sore throats, really bad respiratory diseases that spread very easily. We deal with this stuff all the time, in today even. But even like epidemics would be perhaps classified in many cases as Wenbing. Malaria, all these kinds of things. And these are distinct from earlier cold damage Shanghan framework. So these are important things to know as acupuncturists and herbalists, because a lot of ideas are Shanghan ideas, Shanghanlun ideas. A lot of ideas are Wenbing ideas. These are two huge categories. I would say those are the perhaps two most important and influential schools of thought of all the ones that we've talked about. you have the warm supplementation, you have the earth school, you have the purgation, you have all these Songjin Yuan masters and everything. They're great and they're influential, but the Shanghan Lun, #1, and then Wenbing is also really influential. So just putting that out there. And this has to do with acupuncture too, because we treat these diseases with acupuncture. So Wenbing refers to warm diseases, warm pathogens. Acute illnesses caused by external heat or warm pathogenic factors. These are often infectious or epidemic in nature. These include high fevers, respiratory issues, contagious outbreaks, ranging from common colds to severe epidemics. The concept appears in ancient texts like the Neijing, and also in the Shanghan Lun, where warm diseases were initially seen as a subtype or transformation of a cold damage disorder. So you get cold damage, it would transform into a warm disease, a Wenbing disease. But now this is changing. Now we're saying there's outright warm diseases, Wenbing diseases. They're not just transformations. So Wenbing evolved significantly from the late Ming Dynasty amid devastating epidemics during the Ming and the Qing transitionary period. So that's really what fuels this stuff. They are getting hit with insanely devastating pandemics and epidemics. And we're going to talk about some of this stuff, especially, I think we're going to get into one of them. I know for a fact next lecture, but maybe I might have even put it in this one. We'll see. These are the important Wenbing authors. So these are the people, if you want to know about Wenbing, these are who you want to hear about. In chronological order. So first you have Wu Youke, and he's the author of this book called the Wen Yi Lun. It's considered the first Wenbing herbal medicine text. Then you have Ye Tianxie, and he establishes this very important 4-level pattern discrimination concept. And that is, you have the Wei level, the Qi level, the Ying level, and the Shui level. So it's like you have your very exterior level, you have your Qi level, you have your Ying nutritive level, and then at the deepest level you have the blood. And so if you remember back to the Shanghan Lun, there's also that theory of transformation. We kind of just very briefly mentioned it. We didn't go into it super in depth, but there's this theory of transformation of illness. The illness enters from the exterior and it transforms through the organ levels. It goes from, the Tai Yang to the Xiao Yang to the Yang Ming, etc., etc. It's sort of similar to that, except instead of using those acupuncture channels as the levels, he's using the Wei, Qi, Ying, and Shui. And that's very important to understanding Wenbing theory. So that he also develops ideas with how the triple burner is involved with warm disease, because you can have it, for instance, like a warm disease that's afflicting the lower jiao or the middle jiao or the upper jiao. Damp heat likes to go to the lower jiao, that kind of a thing. So the triple burner becomes a very important concept in Wenbing. And so he develops the four-level pattern discrimination. He develops triple burner ideas. And he focuses on rapid progression and protecting the yin, because the warmth, the heat attacks and destroys and vaporizes your yin very quickly. Then you have Shui Shengbai. He specializes specifically in damp heat patterns. So this is very common in warm diseases, Wenbing. The heat combines with dampness, you get damp heat. So this clarifies interactions between the external Yang Ming and the internal Tai Yin. And it provides detailed differentiation and treatment strategies for very complex damp heat conditions. Sometimes they can be mixed. And then lastly, you have Wu Zhutang. He synthesized prior theories, for instance, Ye Tianxi's, and he systematized the triple burner differentiation and really makes it like official as the core framework for warm diseases. He introduced or refined many effective formulas such as Shangju Yin and emphasized yin nourishment alongside the heat clearing. So this is kind of the progression of Wenbing development of ideas chronologically according to the 4 most important authors. Now, if anyone wants to just go and learn about Wenbing as a topic, this is for sure the book that I would recommend. I love this book. It's just a great overview on all this stuff. In this book, you're going to learn about Wenbing theory. You're going to learn about all the main aspects of it. You're going to learn about the 4 levels. You're going to learn about these Sanjiao theories. And you're going to learn about these various authors that we just spoke about that are involved in Wenbing worm disease theory. And they're pictured on the cover here. I love this book. This is such a fabulous, great book. But let me recommend another book in case you're interested. And we live in the modern era. We just went through COVID. We've had now epidemics and pandemics in our lifetimes. But depending on how old you are, you may have even experienced other kinds of epidemics. There's lots of epidemics. But epidemics were a recurring theme throughout all of history in China. So recall back to how we read that preface of the Shanghan Lun by Zhang Zhangjing in our class. If you're in the Wan class, we read his original preface, that brief preface, and he talks about how so many people died from all these illnesses in his family and his neighbors and his village. And that's what prompted Zhang Zhangjing to write the Shanghan Lun. It was a response to all the severe disease outbreaks during his time. Well, in more modern times, you have the Manchurian plague. And the Manchurian plague specifically was a momentous event in the history of Chinese medicine because it was the first time that Western medicine actually offered an alternative. And so this happens at the end of the Qing Dynasty, the Manchurian plague. And we're going to talk about the Manchurian plague a little bit more in depth during our next lesson. But this book here, speaking of epidemics in Chinese medicine, it traces the history of Chinese concepts of warm diseases, Wenbing, from antiquity all the way up to the SARS epidemic. Not quite COVID, because I don't know that it goes all the way up to that, but it talks about the SARS epidemic. And so this is a really cool book. It talks about epidemics, and it talks about it in context of Wenbing, and so that's a really fascinating read. If I would read the other one first, but if you're got a hankering for more info about Wenbing and epidemics, and that's a topic that interests you, go ahead, read that book. I think it's great. Like I said, I'm just providing a roadmap. That's my goal here. So just to mention a little bit about Wenbing theory and epidemics, the way that it relates to epidemics is as follows. Warm disease theory developed specifically to explain and treat epidemic febrile illnesses. It views them as caused by distinct pestilential qi. It's like warm heat pathogens that are invading through your mouth, through your nose. It's not the same as the classic cold damage Shanghan patterns from surface wind cold, right? A little bit of a different situation where that's where the wind and the cold enters through the exterior and it triggers this reaction in the Taiyang where your body gets real tense and tight and there's body pains and there's aches. It's a different thing. It's a pestilence. It's a very virulent, easily spread kind of a thing. So the Wenbing theory provides a framework for rapid onset contagious heat dominant outbreaks. This is like plagues, seasonal epidemics. And these differ from non-epidemic exogenous diseases. It emphasizes progressive heat transmission. That's through the 4 levels in the Sanjiao. And it emphasizes urgently clearing heat and toxins. In short, warm disease is the classical Chinese medical response to epidemic warmth heat fevers. So this is really an important school of thought. It might actually be influenced a little bit by that first author who used very cold medicinals to treat illnesses, but this takes it to a much more refined level. So we are going to talk about, just briefly about the Manchurian plague, but we'll also bring it up next lesson because it has to do with kind of the interfacing between Eastern and Western medicine. But during the Qing Dynasty, there was this plague called the Manchurian plague. The Qing Dynasty faced numerous epidemics, including cholera, smallpox, and plague outbreaks. And these are often tied always throughout history to social upheaval. They occur because of, people are trading, people are passing these diseases along. It's also environmental. But the Manchurian plague, it's also called the Great Manchurian Plague. It occurred during 1910 to 1911. This is towards the end of the Qing Dynasty, the final months of the Qing Dynasty. This is a devastating pneumonic plague outbreak in northeast China, Manchuria, and it originated from infected tarbagan marmots hunted for fur. It spread airborne among crowded migrant workers and hunters, killing around 60,000 people in 6 months with a near 100 mortality rate in untreated cases. This was actually it was a pivotal moment in medicine in China, which is why I'm bringing it up. And, the Qing dynasty, the court, they were very weakened. We're going to talk more about the fall of the Qing dynasty in the beginning of our next lecture, but um, suffice to say that towards the end of the Qing dynasty, they are severely weakened. They are basically demoralized and inept for a number of reasons. There's revolutions happening. There's highly contagious airborne plagues and diseases spreading around that they can't really fix. The pneumonic plague's rapid droplet transmission differed from things that they're used to, like classic bubonic plagues, which are from fleas, or the typical Wenbing worm disease patterns that they tried to use Wenbing to treat this, but it was not really working. Well, the thing that really actually became the most vital, pivotal thing during the Manchurian plague was Western medicine. And the reason for that is Western medicine was able to identify the pathogen because of microscopes, essentially. Nobody really had much of a treatment for it that was great, but at the very least, Western medicine was able to identify the pathogen. And so this created a situation where, towards the end of the Qing dynasty, amidst this horrible epidemic, people were really starting to recognize Western medicine. And now there is kind of this conflict between Eastern medicine ideas and Western medicine ideas that's sort of incubating and emerging out of these kinds of contexts, out of these events. So it marks a major shift. And the event symbolizes the decline of purely traditional responses in Western epidemics, and it also accelerated China's adoption of modern public health in periods to come. We're going to talk a lot about that and a lot about the end of the Qing dynasty and the fall of the Qing dynasty at our next lecture, but we'll probably talk about it a little bit more. We'll see. Wang Qingren is another doctor who I want to mention, though. He's really worth mentioning. He's such a cool, interesting person in a way. He's a really influential author. He developed very novel theories, and these theories were not really what you would call part of the medicine of systematic correspondence. It's not like he was going yin and yang, 5 phases. This is why you should do this because of this, and using those theories as a reason. He was actually someone who, at this period in time, the end of the Qing dynasty, he's someone who was becoming very skeptical and critical of classical Chinese theories, particularly anatomy. And he was very skeptical of the depictions of the organs and the interior of the body, the zong fu that was provided in the classics. He thinks this is not right. And so he writes a work that preempts a lot of the transmission of Western medical anatomy concepts into China. However, it's worth noting that he wasn't right either. His sketches and stuff were not really accurate either, but it was kind of the principle of the thing. He recognized that there was a lot missing in the maybe the anatomical depictions of the interior of the body and the organs. And he came up with some crazy, interesting theories. He had this one theory called the bloodless heart. But the idea was that he was dissecting corpses, which was very taboo. And he kind of had to do it undercover, right? So he got access to these corpses finally, and he was dissecting them. And what he saw made him, really think, wow, okay, the medical depictions of anatomy are definitely wrong. He came up with his own new ideas, and he started to develop his own herbal formulas to treat what he saw in these corpses, which was really a lot of blood stagnation. So he has these really useful formulas which are actually widely used still today, even though maybe he created these with sort of some missing information himself. But the formulas themselves were basically developed to treat blood stagnation, and so he created some of the best blood stagnation formulas out there, and they are just still widely used today. And you'll if you ever take the herbal medicine program at the Wan Institute or elsewhere, you would probably learn about Wang Qing Ren's herbal formulas, like for instance Shui Fu Shu Yu Tong and other things. So these are very powerful blood stagnation herbal medicine formulas. So some great formulas there. So there is a diversity and fragmentation of medicine. As Unshold says, until the beginning of the 20th century, the concepts of systematic correspondence dominated Chinese medical literature, and undoubtedly the approaches of educated practitioners and self-healing private citizens as well, at least among the upper strata of society. But despite this, Unshold goes to great lengths towards the end of our chapter to show the great diversity, pluralism, and fragmentation present in the forms of medicine available towards the end of the dynastic period at the end of the Qing dynasty, when Chinese medicine begins to come into contact with Western medicine. So there is just all of these different competing forms of medicine. It's really a pluralistic space, even at the end there. Now, towards the end of the Qing dynasty, we'll just comment on it a little bit. So despite individual attempts to find a conceptual foundation for resolving internal social conflicts and the growing threat of Western imperial powers, which was a huge threat at this period of time to China, they were under a lot of pressure. A series of events beginning at the end of the 18th century led not only to the demise of the Manchu state, the Qing dynasty, but also ultimately the collapse of imperial rule itself, and with it the conclusion of the entire Confucian epoch. So just to name a couple of these things, we're not going to go into each one, but you know, they're valuable, worthwhile historical topics in and of themselves that you could look at and read about if you want. You have the Opium Wars in the 1800s between China and Britain, where China's forced to open up their borders to the British, and they basically sell opium to Chinese people. And you know, China at that point didn't want to have their borders and their trade open, but they were basically forced to do it by Britain. So this is kind of like what I mean by what Unshold is referring to when he says the growing threat of Western imperial powers. They're really using military force to kind of get their way with in East Asia at this period in time. So there's a lot of humiliation that is caused by foreign interventions in China. There's also rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion. There's the Sino-Japanese War, which we're going to talk about a little bit in depth next lesson, because I think it's a really fascinating historical topic. And there's also another rebellion called the Boxer Rebellion. But suffice to say that this is a really politically unstable period of time towards the end of the Qing dynasty. They really have no way of solving these problems. They just don't know what to do. They kind of like are just out of solutions. They don't have the political power or the understanding to solve it. And ultimately what happens is this leads to the end of the Qing dynasty and ultimately the end of the imperial dynasty as a whole. Whereas previously, whenever there was a falling dynasty, there would be another power that would fill the vacuum and establish themselves as emperors. But in 1911, there's a revolution. It's called the Xinhai Revolution, and this brings down the Qing dynasty. And this leads ultimately to the founding of what's called the Republic of China. When the Manchu leaders announced abdication of the emperor on February 12, 1912, and proclaimed China a republic, it was not so much a result of an immediate military threat from external or internal sources as much an admission of complete perplexity and helplessness to the situation. That's what Unshold says about the situation. And so they were kind of like, we kind of give up. Like, we don't know, we can't actually sustain this political project anymore. And so they abdicated the throne, and ultimately this led to the founding of a Republic of China. And we will see next lesson how that is a very short-lived Republic of China. But just to conclude what we talked about this lesson, we went over some aspects of the Ming Dynasty and medicine during the Ming Dynasty, some important books. We talked about experiential skepticism and the influence of Wang Yangming, that Neo-Confucian philosopher. We talked about the important Materia Medica book by Li Shizhen, and that is called the Ben Sao Gong Mu, and that becomes a new standard for Materia Medica. We talked about Yang Zhizhou and a Zhenju Da Cheng book, and that is the most important acumoxa text of the period, in my opinion, and personally one of my favorite acupuncture and moxibustion books of all time. We mentioned Zhang Jingyue and his Ming Men Ministerial Fire Supplement Yang school of thought. And we talked about the Qing Dynasty ideas of evidentiary scholarship and how those kind of compare and contrast with the Ming Dynasty ones that we just spoke about. We also talked about the importance of Wenbing, warm disease theory in herbal medicine, and some of the evolution and developments of how that emerged. Some of the authors, important people in that. And we also mentioned Wang Qingren's novel theories, and this sort of marks the beginning of a Western medicine influence on East Asian medicine. And now Western medicine and East Asian medicine are now sort of beginning to interface with one another, which is going to segue into kind of like our modern era. And we also talked about the end of the imperial / Confucian era, which perhaps is maybe one of the most significant moments in Chinese history. It's the end of the imperial history, but it's probably one of the most significant moments in all of Chinese history because it marks the end of the imperial history. So that's our lesson for week 12, lesson 12, the Ming and Qing dynasties, the end of the imperial era. Wow, that was quite the marathon of lessons and presentations and lectures on the developments of East Asian medicine over the imperial dynastic period of China. We have finally reached the end of the imperial dynasty, and so that marks, like I said, an important turning point. And so next lesson, we're going to talk about what comes after that. We're going to talk about the modern era, modernism. We're going to talk about the very important craziness of the 20th century, the political situation and the events that occurred during the 20th century, which lead to ultimately the founding of the People's Republic of China. And that's not to be confused with the Republic of China. There's the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. Quite different. And actually, they fight a pretty intense war with one another. And so we're going to be covering all of that next lesson, where we also talk about ultimately the creation and the development of what is now known as TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, where that came from, what that is, and what that represents, and the ideologies and the socio-realities that are involved in that concept, which is probably the most influential idea of East Asian medicine in our modern age. Definitely influences the way that medicine has been exported around the world from China, and the way that it is taught in the West, and among many other things. So, in my opinion, other than maybe like the Han Dynasty, that is probably maybe the most important next lecture. So I'm very much looking forward to talking about that with you. And so thanks everybody for tuning in for our lecture this week, lesson 11. So I'll see you next time. Have a great week.